Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more The Massacre at El Mozote. Today, I think we pick up chapter 4. So, yeah, the hammer and anvil. Let's go ahead and get into this. To reach Perquin from El Mozote, you turn right on the black road and begin to climb. Soon the grade grows steeper. The tropical brush gives place to mountain pine, and the air lightens and grows fresh. Here and there, a bit of sorghum or corn or maguey pokes out from among the trees, but increasingly from the red soil of the mountainside, only great white rocks grow. The overpowering fragrance of freshly cut pine announces the hamlet of La Tejera and its sawmill, a low building of unstripped logs surrounded by stacks of new planks. Finally, a sign announces Perquin. The road tilts sharply upward and becomes a street of large cobblestones, and after a few moments jolting, the traveler comes upon a dramatically uneven town square, which, despite blasted buildings and damaged streets, remains an oddly beautiful, vaguely otherworldly place. At its heart is a bizarre park which accommodates many wildly slanting levels of green grass like lopsided terraces on a cultivated but dilapidated hillside. Bordering the park are a yellow painted clinic, a rough-hewn little hut, and a remarkable church crowned by a bulbous, vaguely Easter-looking temple and decorated on two of its walls by enormous murals facing the park. Calmly blessing his flock appears the huge face of the martyred Archbishop Oscar Romero, assassinated while he was saying Mass. Facing north, a brightly colored map of Americas and Europe, in which a colorful stream of riches, cars, refrigerators, motorboats, flows from New World to Old above the caption 500 years of pillage. When Colonel Monterosa set his helicopter down here in December of 1981, he found a town in government hands, but barely. Only 4 months earlier, in mid-August, the guerrillas had swept out of the surrounding hills and overwhelmed the local National Guard post, killing 4 men and capturing 5. There were many young ones, but some really old ones too. Children in Perquin told Alma Guillermo Prieto, then a stringer for the Washington Post, there were 8 women. Some of them were in uniforms, but most of them were raggedy clothes like us. We knew some of them, and they were from this town. The guerrillas had spent a week and a half digging defensive trenches, buying corn from the local cooperative, and marching about the streets shouting Pueblo Libre, and other slogans. When the Air Force began bombing the city 10 days later, the guerrillas swiftly vanished, fading into the mountains and ravines they knew so well, and leaving behind the 4 dead men buried in a bomb crater, and also the civilians who had been there all along. The civilians who, after playing host to the guerrillas for 10 days, now gazed with all innocence into the faces of the National Guardsmen who had come to take the places of their dead comrades. Colonel Monterosa had thought long and hard about civilians and guerrilla war and the necessity of counterinsurgency, about the frustrations of the odd and bloody conflict that the overextended Salvadoran army had been fighting and losing. When the men of his Atlacado battalion touched down in Perquin that Tuesday morning in December, storming from helicopters in a crouch, gripping their helmets tightly against the backwash of the rotors, the officers had in their pockets list of names to hand to the National Guardsmen who were waiting to receive them. While the Atlacado captains mustered their troops, the guardsmen rushed off through the town and pounded on doors. They were big men, well-fed, and they looked even bigger than they were, outfitted in high black boots and uniforms of heavy greenish-brown cloth with automatic rifles on their backs, the razor-sharp machetes hanging at their belts. In those days, if they came to your house to talk about or to ask you to come with them to do something, you'd end up dead. A Paraguayan man whom the guardsman visited that morning told me. When he heard the pounding and pulled open the door and found the guardsmen there glowering down at him, they always glowered, for their business was, and had been since the early days of the century, to induce fear in the countryside and to stamp out rebellion from the moment it revealed itself as a lessening of fear in the campesinos' eyes. This man could only try to control his terror as the guardsman stared for a moment, then barked, "Hey, we have work to do. Come with us and help us do it." The man came outside, watched as one of the guardsmen ran his finger down the list that Monterosa's men had handed him, then looked up, exchanged glances with his partner, and murmured, "Ya vamos dándole. Now let's get started." The Perkin man knew what that meant. The killing was about to begin, and, in a panic, he began to protest, digging an identification card out of his pocket and begging the guardsman to look at it carefully. Finally, after a terrible few minutes, he succeeded in convincing these impassive men that the name on the list was not his, that one of the surnames was different. Nonetheless, the guardsmen hustled him along the streets with them, but as they moved through town, they pounded on other doors and collected other frightened men. These men numbered 10 by the time they reached a field in the front of the clinic, which was a blur of unaccustomed activity. Helicopters landing and hovering and departing, and amid the blast and the roar from the rotors, hundreds of men in green moving about, checking weapons, cinching the straps on their packs, and talking among themselves as officers marched back and forth, shouting orders. By then, several hundred of the Atlacado soldiers had stormed off the helicopters, most of them in olive green and a few in camouflage garb above black jungle boots. On the shoulders of the uniform they bore, in white and yellow, the figure of an Indian and the word Atlacatl, the name of the legendary Indian warrior who had led the fight against the conquistadors. To a practiced eye, they seemed to be somewhat different breed from most Salvadoran soldiers. More businesslike, grimmer even, and then equipment was better. And their equipment was better. They had the latest American M16s, plenty of M60 machine guns, 90mm recoilless rifles, and 60 and 81mm mortars. But it wasn't their equipment that made them the elite American trained Atlacatl battalion, as press accounts invariably identified them. It was their aggressiveness, their willingness to do the job, a willingness that the rest of the badly led and badly trained army generally lacked. In part, perhaps this aggressiveness was instilled by American trainers, special forces personnel who, beginning in March, had been coming over from Southern Command in Panama to show the Salvadoran recruits how to shoot and how to seize positions. Mostly, though, it came from Monterosa, among senior field commanders who, in many cases, as one lieutenant put it to me, don't even own fatigues. Monterosa seemed a soldier of the classic type. Aggressive, charismatic, a man who liked nothing better than to get out in the field and fight alongside his troops. The Salvadoran grunts, mostly undeterred peasant boys, many of whom had been pulled from buses or off-country roads and pressed into service, having received little training and less regard from their officers, loved Monterosa for his willingness to get down in the dirt with them and fight. The press loved him, too. Not only was he a natural story, the dynamic gung-ho colonel, he was only too happy in an officer corps distinctly hostile to the press to invite reporters to come along with him in his helicopter. And of course, the Americans loved him as well. Colonel John Cash, a United States military attaché, speaks of a gunshot strategist, the Monterosa, whom I put up against any American hotshot. By then, the Americans were growing desperate, for as the war moved decisively to the countryside, the American government was no longer able to deny that it had a major problem on its hands. True, the Salvadorans had become so decapitate, the urban left, the Salvadorans had managed to decapitate the urban left, but this adversary had been largely unarmed. In the countryside, the guerrillas were shooting back, and the Salvadoran officers were showing themselves utterly incapable of fighting a war of rural counterinsurgency. Not only was the army, with a total of 13,000 men, facing perhaps a third that many guerrillas, terribly overstretched, but its officer corps were burdened by a Byzantine political structure and perverse system of anti-incentives. The most important commands from the military point of view were of the point of view of most Salvadoran officers the least desirable. And the result was that those posts tended to be assigned to the politically least powerful and often least talented members of the officer corps. The guys in the real combat commands, these tended to be the total incompetents. Todd Greentree, who was a junior reporting officer in the United States Embassy at the time, told me these guys would be sent out there to the end of the line and they'd spend their days drinking in the quartel. Embassy officials recommended, cajoled, and finally urged reassignments, but changes, when they came at all, came only after enormous effort. The explanation was not part of the superior political and economic power of the right wing of the officer corps, but was the fact that the Tanda system, in which classmates, no matter what their failings, were fiercely protected, appeared nearly impervious to outside pressure, including pressure from the Americans, who were now pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into the country. As the officers understood only too quickly, the ultimate sanction that the Americans could brandish, turning off the aid spigot, threatened to hurt the Americans themselves as much as it would hurt the Salvadorans, since the American fear of a communist El Salvador taking its place alongside Sandinista Nicaragua had become overriding. Even during the final months of the Carter administration, the underlying reality became embarrassingly evident when President Carter, after cutting off aid in response to the murder of the American churchwomen, rushed to restore it only a few weeks later in the face of the rebels' final offensive. Ronald Reagan did not suffer from the same ambivalence. By the fall of 1981, Reagan had removed the outspoken American ambassador Robert White, had vowed through Secretary of State Alexander Haig to draw the line in El Salvador against communist subversion in the hemisphere, and almost doubled economic aid for El Salvador to $144 million and increased military aid from $26 million to more than $35 million, and in November had begun funding the Nicaraguan Contra fighters in a proxy force against the Sandinista government. By late 1981, the priorities of American policy in El Salvador had become unmistakable. So yeah, we'll end this piece right there. It's a long chapter, but we see how the so-called officers actually were. most of them were unfit for the role. Most of the more powerful tended to be these little battalions that they said were probably trained by American Special Forces. And you could see how they would just drag people in and say, "You're now a guardsman. Go guard." And it's like, seriously? But yeah. And we can see how the American money is funded. Remember, this is still during the Cold War. It's in the waning decade. The 1980s. Because we know the USSR fell 91, 93, something like that. It was early 90s. But yeah. So we're in the waning days of the Cold War, and they're so afraid of another leftist regime, a communist regime, taking up just next door in Latin America, where you already had the Sandinistas, the leftist Sandinistas in Nicaragua. This is interference that did not need to happen. It should have never have happened. But America has a tendency to say it's our way or the highway. And if they know it might be unpopular, they do it in quiet. As has found to be the case several times in American history. As I've said before, I would love to see a Pax Americana. An American peace. No, special operations missions, no wars. We just have an extended period of peace in America. We don't have to constantly be at war. I explained this before. America has had a tiny, tiny window in its existence where it has not been in a war or conflict of some kind, domestic or foreign. As I've said though before, I will talk bad about the mistakes. But it doesn't mean I hate my country. It just means I accept the fact that we have done some very horrid things. Unfortunately, there's too many who are like, "You either love America or get out." Seriously, that's how it is. You don't speak nice about America. You're supposed to love it. Kiss its ass. Look, I love the country. I love my home. But when mistakes are made, I will call them out. Those of you who refuse to do so, you're nothing. Honestly, you're nothing but bootlickers. You're not being patriotic. You're being sycophantic. You're kissing ass just to kiss ass. But yeah, I'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.